Alright, okay, finishing. Oh, I spit in my mouth immediately. Hold on. Next 10 pages. Okay. Actually, I think I'm reading 11 maybe, because at 10 there's like a weird cutoff. No, I'm reading 10-ish. I don't know. I'm going to 684. No, 685. I'm going to 685. Cool. War by Act of Germany. I'm on 673. War by Act of Germany. Destiny dealt cruelly with Woodrow Wilson. The lover of peace, as fate would have it, was forced to lead a hesitant and peace-loving nation into war. As the last days of 1916 slipped through the hourglass, the president made one final futile attempt to mediate between the embattled belligerents. On January 22, 1917, he delivered one of his most moving addresses, restating America's commitment to neutral rights and declaring that only a negotiated peace without victory would prove durable. Germany's warlords responded with a blow of the mailed fist. On January 31st, 1917, they announced to an astonished world their decision to wage unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking all ships, including America's, in the war zone. Why this rash act? War with America was the last thing Germany wanted. But after 3 ghastly years in the trenches, Germany's leaders decided the distinction between combatants and non-combatants was a luxury they could no longer afford. Thus, they jerked on the string they had attached to their Sussex Pledge in 1916, desperately hoping to bring Britain to its knees before the United States entered the war. Wilson, his bluff called, broke diplomatic relations with Germany, but refused to move closer to war unless the Germans undertook overt actions against American lives. To defend American interests short of war, the president asked Congress for authority to arm American merchant ships. When a band of Midwestern senators launched a filibuster to block the measure, Wilson denounced them as a little group of willful men who were rendering a great nation helpless and contemptible. But their obstruction was a powerful reminder of the continuing strength of American isolationism. Meanwhile, the sensational Zimmermann Note was intercepted and published on March 1st, 1917, infuriating Americans, especially Westerners. German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann had secretly proposed a German-Mexican alliance, attempting an anti-Yankee Mexico and with veiled promises of recovering Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. On the heels of this provocation came the long-dreaded overt acts in the Atlantic, where German U-boats sank 4 unarmed American merchant vessels in the first 2 weeks of March. As one Philadelphia newspaper observed, the difference between war and what we have now is that we aren't fighting back. Simultaneously came the rousing news that a revolution in Russia had toppled the cruel regime of the Tsars. America could now fight foursquare for democracy on the side of the Allies, without the black sheep of Russian despotism in the Allied fold. Subdued and solemn, Wilson at last stood before a hushed joint session of Congress on the evening of April 2, 1917, and asked for a declaration of war. He had lost his gamble that America could pursue the profits of neutral trade without being sucked into the ghastly maelstrom. A myth developed in later years that America was dragged unwittingly into war by munition market makers and Wall Street bankers desperate to protect their profits and loans. Yet the weapons merchants and financiers were already thriving, unhampered by wartime government restrictions and heavy taxation. Their slogan might well have been neutrality forever. The simple truth is that British harassment of American commerce had been galling but endurable. Germany had resorted to the mass killing of civilians. The difference was like that being between a gang of thieves and a gang of murderers. President Wilson had drawn a clear, if risky, line against the depredations of the submarine. The German High Command, in a last desperate throw of the dice, chose to cross it. In a figurative sense, America's war declaration of April 6, 1917 bore the ambiguous trademark made in Germany. Okay. Wilsonian idealism enthroned. It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, Wilson said in his war message. It proved fearful indeed. How could the president arouse the American people to shoulder this unprecedented burden? For more than a century, they had prided themselves in their isolation from periodic outbursts of militarized violence that afflicted the old world. Since 1914, their pride had been reinforced by the bountiful profits gained through neutrality. German U-boats had now roughly shoved a wavering America into the abyss, but ominously, no fewer than 6 senators and 50 representatives, including the first Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin of Montana, had voted against the war resolution. Wilson could whip up no enthusiasm, especially in the landlocked Midwest, by calling on the nation to fight and to make the world safe from the submarine. To galvanize the country, Wilson would have to proclaim more glorified arms, radiating the spiritual fervor of his Presbyterian ancestors. He declared the supremely ambitious goal of a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. Brandishing the sword of righteousness, Wilson virtually hypnotized the nation with his lofty ideals. He contrasted the selfish war aims of the other belligerents, allied and enemy alike, with America's shining altruism. America, he preached, did not fight like other belligerents for the sake of riches or territorial conquest. The Republic sought only to shape an international order in which democracy could flourish without fear or of power-crazed autocrats and militarists. In Wilsonian idealism, the personality of the president and the necessities of history were perfectly matched. The high-minded Wilson genuinely believed in the principles he so eloquently intoned, especially his prophetic insight that the modern world could not afford the kind of hyper-destructive war that advanced industrial states were now capable of waging. In any case, probably no other argument could have successfully converted the American people from their historic hostility to involvement in European squabbles. Americans, it seemed, could be either isolationists or crusaders, but nothing in between. Wilson's appeal worked, perhaps too well. Holding aloft the torch of idealism, the president fired up the public mind to a fever pitch. Force to the utmost, force without stint or limit, he cried, where the country responded less elegantly with, "Hang the Kaiser." Lost in the gale was Wilson's earlier plea for peace without victory. Wilson's 14 potent points. Wilson quickly came to be recognized as the moral leader of the Allied cause. He scaled a summit of inspiring oratory on January 8, 1918, where he delivered his famed 14 points address to an enthusiastic Congress. Although one of his primary purposes was to keep reeling Russia in the war, Wilson's vision inspired all the drooping allies to make mightier efforts and demoralize the enemy governments by holding out alluring promises to their dissatisfied minorities. The first 5 of the 14 points were broad in scope. 1. A proposal to abolish secret treaties pleased liberals of all countries. 2. Freedom of the seas appealed to the Germans, as well as to Americans who distrusted British sea power. 3. A removal of economic barriers among nations had long been the goal of liberal internationalists everywhere. 4. A reduction of armament burdens was gratifying to taxpayers in all countries. 5. An adjustment of colonial claims in the interests of both native peoples and the colonizers was reassuring to the anti-imperialists. Indeed, Wilson's pronouncement about the colonies was potentially revolutionary. It helped to delegitimize the old empires and open the road to eventual national independence for millions of subject peoples. Other points among the 14 proved to be no less seductive. They held out the hope of independence, self-determination, to oppressed minority groups such as the Poles, millions of whom lay under the heel of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The capstone point, number 14, foreshadowed the League of Nations, an international organization that Wilson dreamed would provide a system of collective security. Yet Wilson's appealing points, though raising hopes the world over, were not everywhere applauded. Certain leaders of the Allied nations, with an eye to territorial booty, were less than enthusiastic. Hard-nosed Republicans at home grumbled, and some of them openly mocked the 14 commandments of God Almighty Wilson. Manipulating minds and stifling dissent. Mobilizing people's minds for war, both in America and abroad, was an urgent task facing the Washington authorities. For this purpose, the Committee on Public Information was created. Headed by a brash journalist, George Creel, his job was to sell America on the war and sell the world on Wilsonian war aims. Creel's organization, employing some 150,000 workers at home and overseas, proved that words were indeed weapons. It sent out an army of 75,000 4-minute-men, often longer-winded than that, who delivered countless speeches containing much patriotic pep. Creel's propaganda took varied forms. Posters were splashed on billboards in the Battle of the Fences as artists rallied to the colors. Millions of leaflets and pamphlets which contained the most pungent Wilsonisms were showered like confetti upon the world. Hang the Kaiser movies, carrying such titles as The Kaiser, The Beast of Berlin, and To Hell with the Kaiser, revealed the helmeted Hun and at his bloodiest. Arm-waving conductors by the thousands led huge audiences in songs that poured scorn on the enemy and glorified the boys in uniform. The entire nation, catching the frenzied spirit of a religious revival, burst into song. This was undoubtedly America's singingest war. Most memorable was George M. Cohan's spine-tingling "Over there. Over there, over there. Send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the drums rum-tumming everywhere." Creel typified American war mobilization, which relied more on aroused passion and voluntary compliance than on formal laws, but he oversold the ideals of Wilson and led the world to expect too much. When the president proved to be immortal and not a god, the resulting disillusionment both at home and abroad was disastrous. Patriotic fervor also had a darker side. German Americans numbered over 8 million, counting those with at least one parent foreign-born, out of a total population of 100 million. Most proved to be dependably loyal to the United States, yet rumor-mongers were quick to spread tales of spying and sabotage. Even trifling epidemics of diarrhea were blamed on German agents. A few German Americans were tarred, feathered, and even beaten. In one extreme case, a German socialist in Illinois was lynched by a drunken mob. As emotion mounted historical hatred of Germans and the things Germanic swept in the nation. Orchestras found it unsafe to present German-composed music, like that of Wagner or Beethoven. German books were removed from library shelves, and German classes were canceled in high schools and colleges. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage, hamburger, Liberty steak. Even beer became suspect, as patriotic Americans fretted over the loyalty of breweries with names like Schlitz and Pabst. Both the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 reflected current fears about Germans and anti-war Americans. Especially visible among the 1900 prosecutions pursued under these laws were anti-war socialists and members of the Radical Industrial Workers of the World, IWW. Kingpin socialist Eugene V. Debs was tried under the Espionage Act in 1918 and sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. IWW leader William D. Big Bill Haywood and 99 associates were similarly convicted. Virtually any criticism of the government could be censored and punished. Some critics claimed the new laws were bending, if not breaking, the First Amendment, but in Schneck versus United States, the Supreme Court affirmed their legality, arguing that freedom of speech could be revoked when such speech posed a clear and present danger to the nation. These prosecutions form an ugly chapter in the history of American civil liberty with the dawn. These prosecutions form an ugly chapter in the history of American civil liberty. With the dawn of peace, presidential pardons were rather freely granted, including President Harding's to Eugene Debs in 1921. Yet a few victims lingered behind bars in the late 1930s. Forging a war economy. Victory was no foregone conclusion, especially since the Republic, despite ample warning, was caught flat-footedly unready for its leap into global war. The pacifistic Wilson had only belatedly backed some mild preparedness measures beginning in 1915. It would take a Herculean effort to marshal America's daunting but disorganized resources to throw them into the field quickly enough to bolster the Allied war effort. Towering obstacles confronted economic mobilizers. Sheer ignorance was among the biggest roadblocks. No one knew precisely how much steel or explosive powder the country was capable of producing. Old ideas also proved to be liabilities, as traditional fears of big government and hamstrung efforts to orchestrate the economy from Washington. The largely voluntary character of economic war organization testified to ocean-insulated America's safe distance from the fighting, as well as to the still modest scale of government powers in the progressive era of republic. Late in the war, after some bruising political battles, Wilson succeeded in imposing some order on this economic confusion. In March 1918, he appointed Lone Eagle stock speculator Bernard Baruch to head the War Industries Board. Although the board had only feeble form of powers and was disbanded just days after armistice, it sent a president for the federal government to take central role in economic planning in a moment of crisis. As the larder of democracy, America had to feed itself and its allies. Herbert C. Hoover, the Quaker humanitarian head of the Food Administration, shared his fellow war administrators' preference for relying on voluntary compliance rather than compulsory edicts. He deliberately rejected issuing ration cards, a practice used in Europe. Instead, he waged a whirlwind propaganda campaign through posters, billboards, newspapers, pulpits, and movies. To save food for export, Hoover proclaimed Wheatless Wednesdays and Meatless Tuesdays, all on a voluntary basis. Even children, when eating apples, were urged to be patriotic to the core. The country soon broke out in a rash of vegetable victory gardens. Thanks to the fervent patriotic wartime spirit, Hoover's voluntary approach worked. Farm production increased by 1/4, and food exports to the Allies tripled in volume. Hoover's methods were widely imitated on other war agencies. Congress severely restricted the use of foodstuff for manufacturing alcoholic beverages, and the war-spawned mood of self-denial helped accelerate the wave of prohibition that was sweeping the country. Many leading brewers were German-descended, and this taint made the drive against alcohol all the more popular. Reformers' dream of a saloonless nation was finally achieved, temporarily, in 1919, with the passage of the 18th Amendment, prohibiting all alcoholic drinks. As prohibition indicated, despite the Wilson administration's preference for voluntary means of mobilizing the economy, over the course of the war, the federal government expanded in size and power. The War Industries Board eventually issued production quotas, allocated raw materials, and set prices for government purchases. Following the indescribable traffic snarls in late 1917, Washington took over the railroads. Time itself came under Uncle Sam's control when the entire country was ordered to observe daylight saving time to extend the workday and save on fuel. Workers in wartime. Spurred by the slogan, "Labor will win the war," American workers sweated their way to victory. In part, they were driven by the War Department's work or fight rule of 1918, which threatened any unemployed male with being immediately drafted, a powerful discouragement to go on strike. But for the most part, government tried to treat labor fairly. Samuel Gompers and his American Federation of Labor, AFL, loyally supported the war and were rewarded for it. At the war's end, the AFL had more than doubled its membership to over 3 million, and in the most heavily unionized sectors, coal mining, manufacturing, and transportation, real wages had risen more than 20% over pre-war levels. Yet labor still harbored grievances and provoked unrest. Federal recognition of the right to organize eluded labor's grasp, with wartime inflation threatened to eclipse wage gains. 6,000 strikes, several bloody, broke out in the war years. The radical anti-war industrial workers of the world, known as the Wobblies, and sometimes derided as the I Won't Works, engineered some of the most damaging industrial sabotage, and not without reason. Transient laborers in such industries as fruit and lumber, the Wobblies were victims of some of the shabbiest working conditions in the country. In 1919, the greatest strike in American history rocked the steel industry. More than 250,000 steelworkers walked off their jobs to force employers to recognized their right to bargain collectively. The steel companies refused to negotiate and brought in 30,000 African American strikebreakers to keep the mills running. After bitter confrontations that left more than a dozen workers dead, the strike collapsed, a grievous setback that crippled the union movement for more than a decade. The black workers who entered the steel mills in 1919 were but a fraction of the tens of thousands of Southern blacks drawn to the North by the magnet of war industry employment. These migrants made up the small-scale beginnings of the Great Migration, a northward trek that would eventually grow to massive proportions. Their sudden appearance in the previously all-white areas sometimes sparked interracial violence. An explosive riot in East St. Louis, Illinois, in July 1917 left 9 whites and at least 40 blacks dead. An equally gruesome race riot ripped through Chicago in July 1919, triggered by an incident at a bathing beach that followed the years of tension between the white working-class residents and African Americans toiling as strikebreakers in meatpacking plants. 15 whites and 23 blacks were killed during nearly 2 weeks of terror. Suffering until suffrage. Oh, my teeth. Women also heeded the call of patriotism and opportunity. Thousands of female workers flooded into factories and fields, taking up jobs vacated by men who left the assembly line for the front line. But the war split the women's movement deeply. Many progressive-era feminists were pacifists, inclined to oppose the participation both of America in the war and women in the war effort. This group found a voice in the National Women's Party, led by Quaker activist Alice Paul, which demonstrated against Kaiser Wilson with marches and hunger strikes. But the larger part of the suffrage movement, represented by the National American Women's Suffrage Association, supported Wilson's war. Leaders echoed Wilson's justification for fighting by arguing that women must take part in the war effort to earn a role in shaping the peace. The fight for democracy abroad was women's best hope for winning true democracy at home. War mobilization gave new momentum to the suffrage fight. Impressed by women's war work, President Wilson endorsed women's suffrage as a vitally necessary war measure. In 1917, New York voted for suffrage at the state level. Michigan, Oklahoma, and South Dakota followed. The next year, governments in Great Britain, Austria, Hungary, and Germany extended the suffrage to women. Not long after, the United States followed suit. In 1920, more than 70 years after the first calls for suffrage at Seneca Falls, the 19th Amendment was ratified, giving all American women the right to vote. Despite political victory, women's wartime economic gains proved fleeting. Although a permanent women's bureau did emerge after the War Department of Labor, most women workers soon gave up their war jobs. Congress affirmed its support for women in their traditional role as mothers when it passed the Shepherd-Towner Maternity Act of 1921, providing federally financed instruction in maternal and infant health care. In doing so, it also expanded the responsibility of the federal government for family welfare. Partial to the feminist victories were the developments of the World War I era foreshadowed a future when women's wage labor and political power could reshape the American way of life. Making plowboys into doughboys. Most citizens at the outset did not dream of sending a mighty force to France, assuming American naval power and material support would suffice. But in April and May of 1917, the European associates confessed that they were scraping the bottom not only of their money chests, but more ominously of their manpower barrels. A huge American army would have to be raised, trained, and transported, or the whole Western Front would collapse. And America's army was hardly huge. With 100,000 regulars at the war's eve, it ranked only 15th among the armies of the world. Conscription was the only answer to the need of raising an immense force with all possible speed. Wilson disliked a draft, as many other Americans with Civil War memories, but he eventually accepted conscription as a disagreeable and temporary necessity. The proposed draft bill immediately ran into a barrage of criticism in Congress, where one member declared that there was a precious little difference between a conscript and a convict. 6 weeks after declaring war, Congress gradually passed conscription to supply the manpower for the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, in Europe. The draft machinery, on the whole, worked effectively. Within a few frantic months, the Army grew to over 4 million men. For the first time, women were admitted to the armed forces, some 11,000 to the Navy and 269 to the Marines. The Army refused to enlist them. African Americans also served in the AEF, though in strictly segregated units and usually under white officers. Military authorities hesitated to train black men for combat, and the majority of black soldiers were assigned to construction battalions or put to work unloading ships. Recruits were supposed to receive 6 months of training in America and 2 more months overseas, but so great was the urgency that many doughboys were swept swiftly into the battle, secretly knowing how to handle a rifle, much less a bayonet. America helped hammer the Hun. Russia's collapse underscored the need for haste. The communistic Bolsheviks, after seizing power in the late 1917, ultimately withdrew their beaten country from the capitalistic war early in 1918. This sudden defection released hundreds of thousands of battle-tested Germans from the Eastern Front facing Russia to the Western Front in France, where, for the first time in the war, they were developing a dangerous superiority in manpower, and the Yanks were yet to arrive. France gradually began to bustle with American doughboys. The first trainees to reach the front were used as replacements in the Allied armies and were generally deployed in quiet sectors with the British and French. The newcomers soon made friends with the French girls, or tried to. One of the most sung about women in history was the fabled Mademoiselle from Armentières. A printable stanza ran, "She was true to me, she was true to you, she was true to the whole damn army too." Not surprisingly, American soldiers suffered from high rates of venereal disease. Venereal disease? The dreaded German drive on the Western Front exploded in the spring of 1918. Spearheaded by about 500,000 troops, the enemy rolled forward with a terrifying momentum. So dire was the peril that the Allied nations for the first time united under a supreme commander, the quiet French Marshal Foch, whose axiom was to make the war is to attack. At last, the ill-trained Yanks were coming, and not a moment too soon. Late in May 1918, the German juggernaut, smashing to within 40 miles of Paris, threatened to knock out France. Newly arrived American troops, numbering fewer than 30,000, were thrown into the beach at Chateau-Thierry, right in the teeth of the German advance. This was a historic moment, for the first significant engagement of American troops in a European war. Battle-fatigued French soldiers gaped as the roads filled with endless truckloads of American doughboys, singing New World songs at the top of their voices, a seemingly inexhaustible flood of fresh and gleaming youth. It was clear that a new American giant had arisen in the west to replace the dying Russian titan in the east. America had now put decisive military weight on the scales. By July 1918, the awesome German drive had spent its force, and the AEF joined a Foch counteroffensive in the Second Battle of the Marne. This engagement marked the beginning of a German withdrawal that was never effectively reversed. In September 1918, 9 American divisions, about 246,000 men, joined 4 French divisions to bust the Germans from the Saint-Mihiel salient, a German dagger in France's flank. The Americans, meanwhile, demanded and got a separate army under their own command. General John J. Pershing was assigned to a front of 85 miles, stretching northwestward from the Swiss border to meet the French lines. As part of the last mighty Allied assault, Pershing's army entered the Meuse-Argonne offensive from September 26 to November 11, 1918. This battle, the most gargantuan thus far in American history, lasted 47 days and engaged 1.2 million American troops, with especially heavy fighting in the rugged Argonne forest. The killed and wounded mounted to 120,000. Victory was in sight, and fortunately so. The slowly advancing American armies in France were eating up their supplies so rapidly that they were in grave danger of running short, but the battered rearmen were ready to stagger out of the trenches and cry, "Comrade, comrade." Their allies were deserting them. The British blockade was causing critical food shortages, and the sledgehammer blows of the Allies pummeled them relentlessly. Propaganda leaflets containing seductive Wilsonian promises rained down upon their crumbling lines from balloons, shells, and rockets. Berlin was now ready to hoist the white flag. In October 1918, the Germans sought from Wilson a peace based on the 14 points, but the president made it clear that the Kaiser must be thrown overboard before any armistice could be negotiated. War-weary Germans took the hint and forced the Kaiser to flee to Holland, where he lived out his remaining 23 years, unwept, unhonored, and unhung. The exhausted Germans laid down their arms at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, and an eerie, numbing silence fell over the Western Front. War-taught America burst into a delirium of around-the-clock rejoicing, as the war to end wars had ended, but the cost exceeded comprehension. Nearly 9 million soldiers had died, and more than 20 million had suffered grievous wounds. To make matters worse, some 30 million people perished in a worldwide influenza pandemic in 1918-19. Over 550,000 Americans, more than 10 times the number of U.S. combat casualties, died from the flu. The United States' main contribution to the ultimate victory had been foodstuffs, munitions, credits, oil for this first mechanized war, and manpower, but not battlefield victories. The AEF fought only 2 major battles at Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne, both in the last 2 months of the 4-year war, and they were still grinding away in the Meuse-Argonne, well short of their objectives when the war ended. It was the prospect of endless U.S. troop reserves, rather than America's actual military performance, that had eventually demoralized the Germans. General Pershing's army itself, meanwhile, purchased more of its supplies in Europe than it shipped from the United States, including most of its artillery and nearly all of its aircraft. America was no arsenal of democracy in this war. The role awaited it in the next global conflict, 2 decades later. Alright. That's part 2. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's only 5 pages left, so I'll do that in a sec.